Hey guys, it's Amber Rain Davis from NotableInk.com, and I'm thrilled to be back with Splitcoaststampers for another tutorial. Today I'm going back to basics and sharing 7 ways you can heat emboss your handmade cards or scrapbooking projects. I thought I'd start off with an overview of the products that I'll use today, however you use whatever you have on hand. There'll be a link to the coordinating blog post in the comments down below, so be sure to check that out for more details. Let's get started. Of course, the most common way to add heat embossing to your projects is stamping. I have a large sentiment stamp in my mini MISTI here, and I'm inking it up with clear embossing ink. Now, clear embossing ink is slow drying and it's sticky. So what happens when you sprinkle your embossing powder over it is the embossing powder sticks to it and holds it in place temporarily until you have a chance to heat set it. Now, I like to do this in a MISTI because I do like to stamp twice. It's difficult to see the clear ink, and because this is kind of like a larger stamp with more solid areas, I want to make sure that I've stamped everything as cleanly as possible. So I do like to double stamp it. While I'm stamping, I'll go ahead and preheat my heat tool. You can see I have the dual speed tool here and I've set it on the highest setting. Typically I preheat and do the heat embossing with the highest setting. The lower setting is great for vellum if you're heat embossing on vellum because it causes less warping. So I've removed my card panel here, and this is Neenah Classic Crest Solar White 80 pound, and I'm going to sprinkle on embossing powder. Here I have the Wow Sugared Almond embossing powder. Now this is a glitter embossing powder, so this is going to be a little bit different than a standard like a clear embossing powder or a translucent embossing powder. Because it has the glitter in it, it's important that you start heating the cardstock from behind. So when you're holding your cardstock also, you want to make sure that you're holding it from the edges and not getting your fingerprints all over your cardstock. Otherwise, your embossing powder is going to stick to the oils that transfer to your cardstock. Of course, you can always pre-treat your cardstock with an anti-powder static tool as well. I do find that to be very helpful. I just funnel the excess back into the container, and you can see that I'm preheating or heating the embossing powder from behind. Whenever you're using a glitter embossing powder, it's important that you start heating from behind your cardstock. Once you start to see the embossing powder kind of twinkle, then you can bring it to the front and start heating from the front. Or you could do all of your heat embossing from behind. The purpose of this is so that the heat tool doesn't blow your glitter away before the embossing powder starts to melt. Once the embossing powder starts to melt, the glitter will be embedded into the embossing powder and it'll be stuck. So then you can bring it to the front. And here you can see how beautifully that heat embossed and that beautiful glitter and shine to this. This is going to be a very clean and simple card. All I'm going to do is to finish it off is add a sub-sentiment, which is birthday, and it's white heat embossed on a black strip of cardstock. And then I'll add this to a purple card base for that extra pop of color. Here's some close-ups so you can see how pretty that glitter is. And the finished card here. Now you could also add sequins. Moving on to the second technique, it's direct ink to paper. We'll take the ink pad directly to the paper. This is my preferred way to create embossed cardstock that I can then die cut. So whether that's a die cut sentiment, or you can see here, I'm doing a heart and a ribbon for this card. Here I have Wow Love is the Drug embossing powder, and I'm going to sprinkle that on generously and then tap it off. Another note about glitter embossing powder is you want to make sure that you very, very lightly tap the cardstock. Here I'm just going to check to make sure I have enough for my die. I added a little bit more, and then I'm going to go ahead and heat set this. You may be able to see a little bit of texture on that, so I'm going to go ahead and emboss this twice. You're going to swipe your embossing pad directly over the embossed area. Make sure that it's cooled completely before you do that. Ask me how I know. And I'm going to sprinkle a second coat on, and you'll be able to see when I emboss this, it's almost going to get like a glassy surface. It's a thicker layer of embossing powder, and it just becomes super smooth when you do it twice. So this is a beautiful technique when you're doing die cuts. Look how pretty that is. So pretty. So I'll let that completely cool, and then I'll go ahead and die cut it. I'm going to create a second panel, and this I wanted in a completely different color so that I could stack these two die cuts. Here I have Wow Taffeta Pink. This is another glitter embossing powder. So as I was saying, you want to lightly tap, because if you tap too hard on your cardstock, you're actually going to knock off all your glitter. So the two important things is heat embossing from the back and ever so lightly tapping your cardstock. You want to keep all of that glitter stuck to your embossing ink. Here you can see the results there, and we'll go ahead and get these die cut. To finish off the card, I popped up both the heart and the ribbon, and then I used a double layer of Dries foam adhesive underneath the sentiment strip. I love this clean and simple card. Moving on to the third technique, we're going to emboss with pigment ink. So you don't always have to use the clear embossing ink. You can also use pigment ink. Now, dye ink is not going to work as well for you. The difference between dye ink and pigment ink is that pigment ink sits on the surface and it's slow drying. As you can see, this clear embossing powder that I'm going to sprinkle on has the ability to stick to this pigment ink that's slow drying. On the other hand, dye ink is actually going to absorb into the paper and it's going to dry fast. So your embossing powders are not likely to stick to those. Moving on to coloring with an embossing pen. This is one of my favorite techniques. So I have that same panel that I stamped with black pigment ink and then embossed with clear embossing powder. I've treated it with an anti-static powder tool because I've kind of touched it all over. And I'm going to use the Wow embossing pen to fill in some of these areas. So I'm filling in the center of the flower, and then this particular stamp set kind of has a sketchy feel to it, and it has these lines, detailed lines on the flowers that I'm going to fill in and heat emboss. Once I have all of the flowers and the flower petals filled in, I'll go ahead and sprinkle on some blue or teal embossing powder here. Gently tap it off, and then I'll go ahead and heat set it. If you do have any stray excess, you can use a dry paintbrush to just knock off that extra powder. Then I'll come in and also do the leaves. So I did fill in a little bit of the stems. Ultimately, I didn't like the color on the stems. So before I heat embossed, I went ahead and just knocked off the part on the stems that I didn't like with that dry brush, and then went ahead and heat embossed the leaves. So here you can see the finished card with just a touch of color, another really beautiful, clean and simple design. For the fifth technique, we'll draw with Wow Embossing Ink Pad Refill Conditioner and Freestyle Tool, or as I'm going to call it for short, the Freestyle Tool. So I'm just going to take this rollerball tool and draw directly onto an A2 size card panel here. And I kind of just swiped it back and forth a couple times. I'm going to emboss this in that same teal embossing powder. I'll go ahead and heat set that. I'll knock off this little bit of extra that we have there first. I'll heat set that, and then I'll go ahead and create another stripe with that same tool, just running that across. So I'm just going to create 3 stripes, but you could do plaid patterns, you could do really thick stripes, you could do thinner stripes, create some beautiful plaid patterns. You could emboss multiple lines at the same time. I've also used this tool through stencils, which gives a really cool effect as well. Here's a close-up of that sketchy feel and texture that you can achieve, and I'm so sorry, but that sentiment is no longer available. Moving on to the 6th technique, we're going to color block with the Wow Mixed Media Embossing Brush. Now this is a really cool product, so I just took the brush out of the container and it's filled with the gel medium that is the embossing ink, and I'm just swiping this brush over and over. So for my first color block, I'm going to do the most solid pattern. I want some sketchy edges, but the actual center of this little kind of like almost brush stroke that you see here is pretty solid. Now for this second one, I didn't re-ink the brush. Same thing for the third one. I didn't re-ink the brush for that. So you'll get to see this dry brush effect that you can create with this embossing brush. So there's lots of applications for mixed media artists with this. It can just add really cool effects. And you can see the difference between solid at the top, kind of more dry brush in the center, and then even more dry brush at the bottom as you get less and less ink on that brush. It might also be fun to try this with stencils. Double embossing is the 7th and final technique, and I do recommend that you do this with a stamp positioner or a MISTI. So we're going to stamp directly on this heat emboss panel, and it could be kind of slippery for your stamp. So using the stamp positioner is going to be really helpful, especially if you want to stamp it twice. So I'm going to stamp this in the pigment ink. So this is black pigment ink again. And this time I'm going to heat emboss it with black embossing powder. So it's going to make it even darker. You can kind of see because of the texture of the embossed panel that's below it, it didn't stamp perfectly, but look how awesome it comes out with also the embossing powder. So when you're embossing, double embossing, you want to make sure that you don't overheat. What will happen is if you start to melt the original panel, then your sentiment is going to blend right into that melted panel underneath, and it won't be very readable. So if you're concerned or you feel like the panel is starting to heat too much, take some breaks, let it cool down, and then start embossing your sentiment again. Here are all the finished cards. I hope that you guys enjoyed these techniques today. It's very much back to the basics, but necessary for new card makers, and possibly maybe you learned something new as a seasoned card maker. Thanks so much for joining me today, and huge thanks to Dina for inviting me to do another tutorial. If you like this video, hit that like and subscribe button down below so that you don't miss any new inspiration from Splitcoast Stampers. Thanks so much.